Good evening, Mayor, Council, City staff. I'm Jared Hernandez, serving as your police chief, and today I'll be doing a shared presentation with Fire Chief Brian Sherrard on the impacts on public safety services as a result of the housing development at 1000 Hillview Court. I also have with me Field Services Division Captain Matt Miller, who can speak to any questions that I might not be able to answer on an operational level. In our slide presentation, Fire Chief Sherrard and I will be covering the calls for service that we're experiencing, both police and fire, as well as the staff time that's being accumulated at that facility. We'll break it down to the types of calls for service, and then Chief Sherrard will bring you into the next steps. Next slide, please. And one more. So what we see on this slide here is really a snapshot of the activity at 1000 Hillview Court over the past 3 years. As mentioned in the presentation earlier, the site was previously a hotel, and it was redeveloped for the purposes of supportive housing. That took place towards the end of 2020. I feel like this microphone's going in and out, sorry. It took place towards the end of 2020. So we thought it would be best suited to include data because it was hotel site, so you can kind of see the full picture of how it's different or how it's the same from that period of time. Just to orientate you to this slide, in the green bars, which are the bars all the way to the left with a yellow outline, that is the data from when it was the extended stay hotel, followed by the navy blue lines, which indicate data for 2021, which is the first full year of service at the Project Homekey site. And then it's partial data for the light blue bars, which represents January 1st of 2022 to August 8th of 2022. So from this slide, one more thing to let you know is that this includes all police events with the exception of patrol checks, and I'll break those out later in the presentation. So over that period of time between 2021 up through now, present time, there's been increased occupancy that's been occurring at that facility. They didn't fill all the rooms right away. So keep that in mind, and that kind of correlates to some of the data that I'm going to be sharing with you. You can see from this slide that there has been increases in our number of calls and activity at that site, moving from 2020, and then a vast increase in activity for 2022, with the last 4 months being the most productive months for us at the police department. Next slide, please. As I move through the following slides, there's a whole array of activity that the police department deals with. And so on the right side of the columns are the types of calls that we go to on a regular basis just as police officers. That would be too busy to present in this presentation, so we categorized it to what you see on the columns on the left. And so I will be referring to burglaries, disorder, drug-related incidents, mental health, suspicious activity, violations, violence, welfare checks, and others. You don't have to write it down. I won't test you later, and I promise to include the information you need to know on the following slides. So next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is police events by categories. The intent of this slide is really to give a deeper understanding of the types of events our officers are handling at 1000 Hillview Court. Again, we did include the 2020 data just for comparison purposes. And it's also, again, important to recognize that the 2022 data is only 8 months because, again, it was captured up to August 8th of 2022. You can see that some of the activity that we are dealing with is similar to the activity that we were dealing with when it was a hotel site, but it's at a greater volume. Again, green being 2020, navy blue 2021, and light blue as 2022. You can see that the top category for us is others, and under bullet point number 1 is a synopsis of what that may include. It may not include all of those, but it definitely includes a good portion of those. Second to the others is our welfare checks. That would be, somebody is going through some type of crisis, or a neighbor thinks that they're going through a crisis, or a family member hasn't heard from their loved one for several days, and they ask the police department to just go check on them and make sure that everything's okay. That's what a welfare check would be. And then we have suspicious activity, which again, under that bullet point is summarized. And what I did not include, and I apologize on that, is disorder. Those are arguments, loud music, those types of calls for service. So we can move to the next slide, please. Go back one more. I think we went one too many. There we go. Thank you. So I did mention earlier that we broke out patrol checks. A patrol check is really just essentially an officer driving by. We typically do that when we have an area that we want to check on, or that we want to try to use our presence as a deterrent. And so we broke out self-initiated events from patrol checks. So you can see from this chart here, when it was a hotel, officers drove through that parking lot 44 times in 2020, just to have officer presence. Because of the new facility and the calls for service in 2021, officers drove through with no further action 111 times. And then again, up till August 8th of this year, 51 times, just doing patrol checks. Those led to nothing. There was no investigation as a result of those. However, self-initiated events, that would be an officer driving through. Maybe they started out as a patrol check, but they saw a suspicious vehicle and they noticed that the license plate was something weird about it. So they ran the license plate, found out it was a stolen car. There's many examples of something like that. And so when it was a hotel, 61 times officers initiated events there that led to some type of investigation. In 2021, which is our first year of Project Home Key, it was 77. And thus far in 2022, we're already at 74 officer-initiated events. And that really correlates with the amount of time our officers are spending at the facility. Next slide, please. On this slide, what we break down is the type of officer-initiated activity that our officers are dealing with. And it very closely correlates, at least the top two, others and suspicious activity, with what we're seeing that are calls for service. I think it's also important to note that our calls for service, by a vast majority, are initiated by residents. So it's not security that's calling us, it's people that live at the facility, which tells me that they need the police and they need some help there. Next slide, please. What we're trying to show here is the average time spent on a call for service, and it correlates to those months as well. So orientating you on the bottom, those are our months across the bottom. To the left side, it's the number of calls. So our bars represent the number of calls. And then the dotted lines represent the average minutes per incident. And we'll get a little more detail into that on the next slide. But what we're seeing, the downward trajectory, it almost looks like black dots on my screen as I look behind you, but the downward trajectory, that is 2020. And so you see a big dip towards the end of 2020, because that's when the transition occurred between hotel to a permanent supportive housing unit. Going into the navy blue lines, that is the line that's almost level going across the screen. And then the light blue bars with the spike is the highest line, where you see that on average, officers are spending more time per incident. Next slide, please. This is a little bit deeper dive into the pictograph that I just shared. And what this shows is in 2021 and in 2022 year to date up to August 8th, the number of calls per month that we're dealing with. So you'll see a month column vertically all the way to the left, followed by a calls column, which is the number of calls, followed by the average time officers spend on those calls. Then from there, what we did is the total time for those 10 calls, where we spent an average of 20 minutes, using January of 2021 as the example. Officers in January spent on average 3 hours and 21 minutes at the site dealing with 10 calls for service. And so you can see very clearly from both of these informational charts that things are increasing. We're spending more time there, and we're there for more time annually. The bottom right column of each year, it says 169 hours for 2021 and 51 minutes. That's how many total minutes and hours the officers spent at that site for 2021. And that would equate to an officer being there nonstop 7 days and 1 hour. And in 2022, it's the same. You can see that we're now at 253 hours and 30 minutes for January 1st of 2022 till August 8th of 2022, which would be an officer sitting there for 10 days and 13 hours as of August 8th. You can also see that the average number of calls for service in 2021 was 26.4. And now in 2022 thus far, we're at 40 calls for service. And for me, I believe I'm now passing it on to Chief Sherrard. Next slide, please.
Good evening, Mayor, Council, City staff. Brian Sherrard, your Fire Chief. I'm going to walk through a very similar data set to what Chief Hernandez just shared. The period of time will be from January of 2020 until the end of July 2022. Next slide, please. So this first slide clearly depicts our rising number of incidents. If you look at the chart on the upper right, that's the incidents by year. So there's a total of 194 incidents during that time period, and a sharp rise in the number of incidents in 2021. And clearly in 2022, just through those 7 months, we've already surpassed the total number of calls from that we had in 2021. And then if you look at the chart that's on the bottom left, that's by month, but just for 2022, and that's showing the drastic rise in the number of calls based on month, which also corresponds to the same rise of number of calls that the police officers are seeing for those same months. Next slide, please. So this graph depicts all the calls that we have by month and by year. And of note, if you look on the far right, it says 340 apparatus responses during that time period. So as I stated before, there was 194 total calls, but the 340 apparatus responses correspond to the number of vehicles, fire department vehicles, that are responding to different incidents. So for example, if there was a fire, you would have multiple units, or a significant medical call, you'd have multiple units. So the impact on our ability to continue to serve the rest of the city directly corresponds not only to the number of incidents that we see, but also the severity of the incidents that may be occurring at this facility. Next slide, please. So we don't have as an extensive breakdown of the types of calls, but we'll go into more detail here on the next slides. But we broke it down into these 5 different categories. EMS being emergency medical calls, alarm being the system, that the fire protection system that's involved with the building, whether it's in the general protected areas or smoke detectors in the actual units themselves. Fires, whether it's a cooking fire or a building fire. Hazardous condition would be something similar to the hazardous materials incident or suspected chemical agent incident that we had there that was pretty significant as far as the amount of time and resources that were taken. And then other, which just includes general type calls. A couple examples are invalid assists, elevator rescues, and smoke removal. Next slide, please. So as I just stated, the different incident types, clearly this chart depicts the majority of the incidents that we have at this facility are medical in nature, and that's consistent with the calls that we have across the entire city. 75 to 80% of the calls that we run as a fire department are medical in nature. And then the next highest number are issues related to the alarm system. That's not uncommon with new buildings and buildings that are under construction and buildings that have multiple units with lots of different occupants that are coming and going. There's a lot of impact on the fire alarm systems. And then you can see the other calls are very few in nature, but as I stated, related to the hazmat call, the hazard call, one of those incidents, we were there, both impacts to both public safety departments, fire department, police department were there for over 24 hours monitoring that incident until we were able to get some of our law enforcement partners to assist with clearing out that facility. So it's a concern for us as we look at the number of calls and the amount of time that we spend on those calls and the impacts that it has on the rest of our ability to continue to serve the city. Next slide, please. So this slide depicts what I was just talking about. It has the number of incidents that we have going across the bottom, as well as the number of total minutes that are spent on those calls. And then the chart on the right, breaks it down a little bit more and just totals all those minutes based on years. And as you can see, the average amount of time that our units are spending on calls at that facility is about 25 minutes. So if you think from a fire department deployment standpoint, we had 5 units that were in the system. We now have 6 with the deployment of the ambulance. So if you're tying up 1 or more of those resources, then it does have a immediate and direct impact on the ability to serve the rest of the city. Next slide, please. So next steps, as George shared, we have been working closely and meeting with our partners, but we still have more work to do. And one of the things that we've identified, we need to have establish a liaison to collaborate with each of the different stakeholders, and that includes the city staff, public safety, and all the other groups that have responsibilities, whether it's Jamboree or the county, Hyder, Abode, on-site security, all those different stakeholders need to have direct contacts. The primary contact, including after hours contact, that is a definite improvement that we have to see. It's difficult for our staff when it's after hours and we're trying to identify who exactly is responsible for one particular aspect of an incident that's going on there, that we have kind of one-stop shopping where we can call a phone number and know exactly who to get hold of and how that's going to help make the incident come to resolution in a much more timely and successful manner. Sharing information on key issues, as stated by George, we are having regular meetings and we are identifying ways that we can collaborate and pass on information, not just from a public safety standpoint, but from a resident standpoint, and issues that may arise, safety issues that may have arisen during a call that affect either other residents or public safety employees that are responding, crimes that may be witnessed or be occurring, what exactly that communication process is and how we work collaboratively to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to keep not just the residents safe, but the first responders safe and keep people housed and on the right path so they can continue to to live and prosper in that facility. And then, as we're doing tonight, we plan to continue to provide quarterly updates to the council, make sure that you're kept in the loop on the challenges and the successes that are occurring within that facility, and helping provide direction for what you may like to see from a city standpoint and from a moving forward standpoint. Next slide, please. So finally, the recommendation to receive the report on Home Key project at 1000 Hillview Court. And we are all available to answer questions, whether it was a presenter or the representatives from the other agencies that I know that are willing to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.